Welcome to Themis Podcasts. Themis is a leading technology platform that helps clients manage their financial crime risk exposure through a combination of innovation, insight, and intelligence. Our podcasts aim to bring you insight, views, emerging trends, and thought leadership from industry leaders and our own financial crime experts. Find out more about Themis at crime.financial. In this episode, Themis' Head of Research, Nadia interviews Katarina Cook, Head of Financial Crime and MLRO for Brewin Dolphin, one of the UK's largest wealth management firms. Katarina tells us all about her experiences as a female leader working in the world of financial crime and shares valuable advice for young people looking to embark on this career path. She also considers the impacts of remote working on women with carer responsibilities and explores what good parental leave policy looks like. This episode is part of a wider series of podcast conversations that Themis is releasing with impressive women working in finance and tech.
Welcome to the next instalment in our Women in Financial Crime series of Themis podcasts, through which we're bringing you exclusive interviews with female leaders working on financial crime topics. Today, I have the great pleasure to be interviewing Katarina Cook, who's a real industry expert, having worked in a range of senior management roles in financial crime prevention across banking and wealth management. Katarina is currently Head of Financial Crime and MLRO for Brewin Dolphin, one of the UK's largest wealth management firms. She has been on the board for ACAM's Netherlands chapter and, until recently, was the chair for the ACAM's UK chapter, supporting ACAMs and industry practitioners to stay informed of regulatory change, trends, and best practices. Katarina, thank you so much for joining me today. It was really interesting to hear from you on a webinar panel that we did last June about financial crime risks in investment management. And it's wonderful to have you back, this time on a Themis podcast, tackling the subject from this important new angle. So one of the goals of today's conversation is really to discuss women's experiences in traditionally male-dominated industries like finance and tech. So starting us off, how would you describe your experience as a woman working in finance?
So first of all, Nadia, thank you so much for having me on a Themis event again. Really excited to be here. I would start by saying that I think that depends a lot on where in the industry you work. I think it depends a lot on the culture of the firm that you work for. I think it depends on the country you work in. I think it depends on your role within that firm. I would even say that depending on where you sit in the lines of defense of a firm can impact that kind of culture and the male domination quite a lot. And it also depends a lot on your line manager and your head of department who sets the culture within your team. So in terms of my own experience, I would actually say it's been overall very positive. I have mainly worked in second line of defense throughout my career, starting in first line, however, not client facing. I've had some fantastic line managers, and I do put a lot of my experience down to that. If you think that men with no children would not be supportive, you should think again. I've had some amazing line managers there, especially the one who took me through my twin pregnancy and coming back from that. Also have some experience of the challenges too. I did have to fight quite hard for my 2 days of working from home a little bit later after that twin pregnancy because I really needed that extra time of getting to nursery and picking up and things like that and managing my workload. That is, however, 10 years ago, and I do think that has changed massively, especially after the pandemic. I've also been in situations where I was almost the only woman in senior management committees. In this case, it was an exco committee. Head of HR was also female, but it certainly made you realize the differences, and it can be quite challenging because you notice your differences before you even start the formal meeting and the setting around that, and you're not always included in the pre-discussions. I was both a woman and perhaps younger than most of my colleagues in that committee. And that can be difficult because when you go into the formal meeting and you then encounter challenge or you're dismissed in some way, it can, rightly or wrongly, mean that you interpret that as a result of you being a woman or you being younger. And that might not be the case or the intention. But when you already find yourself in that position of being the only woman or perhaps one of the few, it can still make you feel that that is the driver for that dismissal. And that's something I think we should be aware of when we go into those positions and try not to think about that as something negative, but as something positive. But like I said, overall, my experience has probably been quite positive, more support than resistance, I would say. And some of that may very well be related to the roles I've had, because I've not been in client-facing teams, which tend to be even more male-dominated, not target-driven, which makes it easier to be flexible. So not as male-dominated, perhaps, as some other parts of the industry.
That's really interesting. Thanks, Katarina. As you said at the start, it's important to draw out those nuances between firms, between countries, between roles within specific firms as well. But when we're talking more broadly about women in finance in 2022 and in the current realities, what do you think the main impacts of COVID and remote working have been, both in terms of the positives and the negatives? And when you compare them to that situation 10 years ago, when you were fighting for the 2 days of working from home a week?
Yeah, let's start with the positives. I do think there's a much better understanding now around flexibility, both in terms of working from home and flexible working hours. And I think that can help both the employee and the employer to get the most out of the working day. I do think it's removed that label that working from home means you work less or you don't do anything. And I think it's that change in attitude can really help all parents and all those caring for other family members to structure their lives in a more family-centered way. So we should see that as a good thing for work-life balance. In terms of downsides, so let's be honest here. How many men have said to you when you talk about homeschooling, "Oh, I must admit that my wife did most of the homeschooling"? I mean, I've heard that so many times now. Mm-hmm. And there are exceptions to this, and there are also good reason for that. You know, every family is its own, right? And they have to make those decisions. But I still think there's a general trend here. And there are exceptions to that, absolutely. And the men that say that are generally very genuinely grateful for the work that their wives have put in. Still, I do think that is the kind of answer that I think I've heard too many times. I think that it brought a lot of stress to women. We tend to take on these kind of responsibilities, right, around the house and the family. I certainly did, and I didn't even think about it. So my lockdown days looked something like this. I would get up early in the morning to get a bit of alone time, maybe go for a run when that was allowed, have breakfast, and then I would log into all these online portals that my boys were using. I've got 3 boys. I would print out worksheets where that was possible to take them off the screen, make sure they knew their schedule for the day, get them in front of the right lessons. And then I would log into work and get started with my working day, although it felt like I'd already done a good few hours, which I kind of had. Then I would put a block in my calendar every day around 10 o'clock, so I could pop out and make sure that they were all okay, they'd done what they should, if I could help them with anything. The lunch was done by Daddy, so Daddy prepared lunch. We all had lunch together, and I checked again that everyone knew what they were doing. And then I would shut the door to my office. Mind you, it would also occasionally be opened when they needed help straight away. And I would always have a block in the calendar again around 2 o'clock to check in with the boys and make sure they had everything under control. And then I would leave them to it and focus on my work until 5, when we sat down and uploaded all the tasks, and I helped them with anything they couldn't finish or anything that they were struggling with. And then make sure that everything was uploaded for the teachers to review at the end of the day. Then we would eat dinner, go on our family walk, put the boys in bed, and I would be back on my computer and finish my own job. So the flexibility was great, but the day was very long. So I do think that is something that, a lot of us felt during that time. And I also think there's a long-term downside here that we should be careful with. And this is my opinion. A lot of people like home working, but I do think there's a danger where people become home workers all the time, because at least I love flexible working, but I also enjoy coming in, seeing colleagues. And I do think, especially for young people that are coming out at the start of their careers, not to see people, not to talk to people face to face, it's really quite damaging long term. We're missing out on really important social connections here and building relationships. So I think that's something employers and line managers should really consider in a long-term view, allowing flexibility, but also wanting to see your colleagues.
Absolutely, and not an easy balance to get right. But thank you very much for sharing this personal experience as well, which I'm sure many of our listeners will be able to really connect and identify with over the COVID period. So you're based in London at the moment, but I know that you've lived and worked in Sweden and in the Netherlands as well. So when it comes to approaches to women in the workplace, we've talked a bit about differences in time periods, in cultures of firms. But have you noticed any particular quirks or differences across these three countries?
Yeah, and it's interesting that it's the Netherlands and Sweden that I've lived in previously. I am Swedish, so I grew up in Sweden, and because they are quite close on this actually, very family-friendly countries, very focused on having good childcare in place, having women out working. So it may be a slightly unfair comparison here. If I'd lived in other countries, I would say something very different here, but actually the UK is quite far behind on certain things, let's be honest. As good as work-life time I've had in the UK, there are definitely things we could learn from these two countries. And I do think there are some main reasons for that. And this is just my opinion, not science-based or anything, but generally men and women share responsibilities more equally in these two countries. I think there are more male role models who take parental leave and they flex their hours and they take the kids to appointments, much more than I have seen in my working capacity in London. And I'm not saying this is my household, but just generally. And this is more accepted by employers as well, that both parties do that, because I've certainly known over the years that there's been resistance when the children's father wanted to take that time. I never had resistance. It's sort of assumed that a woman will do those things. There's also cheap childcare in these countries, especially in Sweden. So it's very family accustomed in the culture. And like I said, the mothers are expected to be working. So there's no, huffing or puffing that, someone hasn't got a wife at home taking care of the household. That's the expectation. And of course, the parental leave is very, very good. And like I said, I'm Swedish, and most of my friends in Sweden, they've shared their parental leave between, their partners and themselves. And it's not strange for a man to ask for 6 months parental leave for each child, for example. And I really purposefully use the term parental leave here and not paternity leave, because it's parental leave in Sweden. It's not divided. And I actually decided to get some statistics here. So it's quite interesting, because this kind of culture doesn't just come out of nothing. It's not that we're just born, more equal or something like that. But actually the government in Sweden has always been very proactive with this. And parental leave has been around for over 45 years. And already from the start, both parents had the right to equal shares of that leave. Now, early on, that was predominantly only taken by women. So in 1974, mothers took 99.5% of all leave. In 2016, that had come down to 75%, so already better. And in 2020, it was 70%. And I actually think that's quite a good number, because let's be honest, at the start of a parental leave, you are going to be breastfeeding and those kind of things, and you would expect the mother to actually probably take a bit more than the father in that case. However, in Sweden, you also have longer parental leave. So there's the opportunity for the father to take quite a long time, even after you, for example, you stop breastfeeding, because you have 1.5 years approximately of parental leave. And this slow but steady progress has been supported by initiatives. So in 1995, each parent was allocated a dedicated month. So if the father didn't take it, it was lost. And maybe that doesn't have such huge impact on 18 months, but in 2002, they increased that to 2 months, and in 2016 to 3 months. So unless the father takes 3 months of parental leave, they will lose that parental leave. So there are things you can do to kind of enforce this kind of behavior. So I do think that's grown a culture through that reform and push to get women out in the workplace.
That's fascinating, and I agree. I've also long been an admirer of the Swedish model. So interesting to hear some of those statistics and case studies. So turning maybe to your recent role as chair for the ACAMS UK chapter, and I know you were also on a board member on the Netherlands chapter. Could you tell us a bit more about the work you did in that capacity?
Yeah, I held various roles within the UK chapter, and the last 2 of those years was as chair or co-chair, and indeed we lived in the Netherlands for 3 years, and during that time I also joined the board of the Netherlands chapter. And it's sort of the nice things with these chapters is that they're industry event organizers, so to speak. So we arranged industry events covering topical financial crime related matters. How you do that depends a bit on the country and the desire and the audience. In the UK, we focused on evening events, fairly short, with a drink afterwards for networking. There's no cost involved at all here. So it's really just built on shared interest and willingness to dedicate the time. And it was a really good way. It's a great way of building a network and raise your profile whilst just doing something you enjoy. And I do think this is important for young women, but everyone else also. It's not just for young women, and it's not just for young professionals. It's good all the way through your career. But I do think these kind of engagements are very valuable for networking, because I'm not the kind of person, I don't like the concept of networking to further your career. I don't walk into a room of peers thinking, oh, I better talk to this person because that could be really good for me in 5 years' time. All you want to do is just build a network of good contacts, nice people. It's really good fun to meet new people, and it's the opportunities that come with that will come when you least expect it, and you don't even know when you'll need it.
I'm just going to pause the podcast here to let you know about Themis Search, an end-to-end SaaS screening and investigations platform that will help you to easily search, screen, and monitor your clients, suppliers, and third parties to check if they have any links to financial crime. It also allows you to perform a deep dive investigation and produce an editable, enhanced due diligence report. It's updated every 6 hours with the latest data, including sanctions, adverse media, law enforcement, and PEP status. We draw data from a wealth of sources, but also have our own proprietary Themis conviction data around different financial crime typologies, making Themis Search highly unique. Book a demo at crime.financial.
So that's a nice segue actually into the topic of young professionals, many of whom we do have amongst our Themis podcast listeners. So I wanted to really ask you whether financial crime prevention is a career path that you'd recommend to young women and men, and if so, why?
I do. I think it's a great career path, and I'll say why, because it gives such enormous flexibility in opportunity and what you want to focus on. So it has a broad variety of roles under the financial crime umbrella. And it means that you can work with, for example, regulatory and legal interpretation and policy development. That's quite analytical, gap analysis, if that's what you like, sitting with something like that all day and really get into the nitty-gritty. You got a really good role there. You could work on the control and process development from that, regulatory and legal interpretation. So it's basically turning that regulation and policy into practice. And this is a really interesting part of the work, and perhaps even the most important one, and probably the one where a lot of the big banks failed and got fined, was because they all had very nice policies, and procedures, and it said that they did all these things like, monitoring their pets, but actually when you looked at the controls that were implemented, they were not effective. They were not risk-based. They haven't looked at, okay, so what, this is the regs, but actually what kind of risk are we facing? What should we be looking for? It's possibly actually the hardest bit of the job as well, right? To get that kind of translation right. This is one area where I find that I really enjoy working, in particular when it comes to financial crime. If you're a bit more techie, you might want to focus on the systems, the technology side of things. I mean, you could just focus on that, monitoring, client screening, AI, get into all the tuning of systems, and that's also really fascinating. Also an area where a lot of the banks got it badly wrong in terms of tuning and understanding, not just to have a system, but how does it actually work, and really understand that. And then, of course, you have the investigation side of things and the suspicious activity reporting, which is also very interesting. And depending on the institution where you work, you could just focus on that. If it's a big bank, in a place like where I work, we don't have that many. So it's just part of the team, that do all the other things I've just talked about. You could focus on MI. Also, again, in a bigger organization, that would just be a full-time job. Collating all the information to try and be able to report upwards into risk committees that where you have control failings, what are you doing about them, and all that kind of thing. So it all flows upwards into board. And also, if you enjoy working with projects and change, there will be project management roles that will be financial crime specific. And again, work for a big place and do one of these things that you really enjoy, become an SME, a subject matter expert, become the one that really digs into it, or take a job with a smaller organization. And I purposefully did that because I wanted to have that breadth of responsibility within the team. So we do all of these things. So that's really interesting, I think, the way that you can structure it how you want it. And also remember, you can move between type of, like I already mentioned, large, small industry practitioners, but you could also move into advisory and work in consultancy. You could work with the vendors that build the system solutions. There are so many ways of finding, what you would like, and you don't have to settle for one straight away. You can try a bit before you decide what it is that you really want to do. So I do think there's that enormous room for flexibility, and also career path within financial crime where you can change your mind, because whatever you've done is still valuable for the next role. You don't have to become an MLRO. You don't have to take that personal liability. You can still move into very senior roles without doing that. So it's all down to your own appetite. And I just think it's really important to think about what you want and ask for what you want, and accept that, maybe some roles are not as flexible as others. If flexibility is very important to you, pick a role that is more flexible. And shape it as you go along, really.
That's great, Katarina. What a comprehensive overview. Thank you. As you say, I would completely agree. It's a very diverse field that caters to different skill sets, and there's something for everyone really within that. So given that we have to sort of wrap up slowly, as a final question, I wanted to ask if there's any advice that you would like to share with young people starting out their careers in the field of financial crime and listening into this podcast today.
Yes, I would, like I said, I would think about what it is that you really want to achieve, what type of role it is that you want. And perhaps at the start of a career, before you may have a family, a lot of office time might be nice to really get into things. It doesn't mean that you have to settle for that later on. You can make change as you go along. And I also think it's important to look at these various types of roles that are available and think about what you enjoy, which type, because it's almost like when I read that list, I know exactly which ones I would go for as my favorite ones to work with. It depends on your personality and what you enjoy doing and how much you want to get into the detail. And then think about as well early on in your career if you can combine that with some development, because there are some absolutely fantastic courses out there now, so much more than when I started. Certificate, diplomas, postgraduate degrees. I mean, there are even full degrees in financial crime. So it's just finding a job that you think you will enjoy, and then you'll grow with that. When I took my first job in London, I rejected a permanent sales role for it was a magazine. I can't remember which one it was, but it was a good magazine. I wouldn't have minded, trying to sell it, but I just didn't feel that a sales role was what I needed. But I applied for anything. It was my first job after uni, and I rejected that for a contract role with this bank I'd never heard of, ABN AMRO, to conduct client risk assessments. And I wasn't even really sure what that meant, but it sounded really like a lot more fun than to make sales calls all day. So I did that, and I would say go with your gut, because I've never looked back after that. I have a couple of key takeaways other than that.
Of course.
Because I thought about this quite a lot. I would say to the women in the audience, never apologize for prioritizing family, and never accept blame for doing it either. And I would say look after your female peers, because supporting each other is very rewarding. And I think that you'll have the reward from that when you least expect it again. It's a bit like networking. You help someone, you will later find that that will help you. For the male listeners, my message would be walk the walk. Don't praise your wives for walking the walk. I cannot stand the LinkedIn posts I've seen where men are writing tributes to their wives for carrying the load of, managing family and work, and then say how they try to help, but they could never do it as well as they do. Just take paternity leave. Leave early to pick up the kids. Stay home with your children. It's just so rewarding to do that. You don't want to miss out, actually. It's not a bad thing. It's a good thing to get involved. And then I would also want to say to employers out there that really have a look at your parental leave policy. If it's still called maternity leave policy, change it. It's parental leave, and ensure that that policy supports both parents to take parental leave on equal terms. Those were my messages, Nadia.
That's brilliant, Katarina. What a strong note to end on. And thank you so much for well-considered and valuable takeaways for a range of different audience members. And thanks just in general for the range of insights you've shared with us today. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you, and I look forward to continuing this important conversation with you and with our listeners today. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to the latest Themis podcast. If you'd like to find out more about Themis, please visit our website at www.crime.financial.